Thanks for having me here. I was proposed to talk about food industry and to talk about environmental and health impacts. So you can imagine that these are, in general, very bad news. You know? So I actually didn't pay much attention to the title. And I started a little bit with that, and then I started talking about possible solutions to that, and not only concentrate on the impacts, right? Because when I started thinking about impacts, actually all these things came to mind. What are impacts on health and environment? It's a long list of things that we can possibly talk about, huh? I mean, lots of things that we could address. So I started with the list with loss of biodiversity, right? And then I said, well, since I started from there, unconsciously, let's start the presentation also from there, right? When we look at current paradigms in agriculture, we often hear terms such as sustainability, but also uncertainties and also complexity. These are the elements that we bring in our systems today, in our research, in our policy development. These are the three elements that are shaping more or less the actions we take in policy, in research, in agriculture. And this, that I'm sure Anne has been talking extensively about this planetary boundaries, but the effects, the impacts that agriculture has on the environment in general. How many of you are agronomists here? How many of you are environmental scientists? Biologists? Economists? Social scientists? All right. Food scientists? Okay. Politologists? No. All right, so I can lie about policy then. Good. So this is the sort of things that we are confronted with, right? But look at those boundaries. I'm not going to explain this again. You saw this already. But concentrate on the importance of the different factors. And for example, climate change, right? Climate change is an important factor. It takes up a lot of the attention. But compared to, for example, loss of genetic diversity, loss of biodiversity, we're still not in the reds, right? However, when we look at the media coverage, you know, the green represents the media coverage over biodiversity, and the brown represents climate change. Biodiversity has 8 times less media coverage than climate change, right? And well, one of the reasons is because we all feel climate change, right? It's felt directly. And it's something that is closer to home. You know, it can happen anywhere. Anywhere where we live, we can face the problem of climate change. But also, whereas when we talk about biodiversity, this is a map that was produced some years ago, a map of where are the hotspots of biodiversity loss, right? All these red areas in the world, and they're far from home, right? So we know there is a problem, but this problem is far from home. We're not seeing it. We're not feeling it every time, right? So when we look at the latest Living Planet report produced by WWF, actually we see a decline in biodiversity in general. There is a decline worldwide, right? And if we look at different species, this is a study that was done comparing the mass extinction. You remember, well, I mean, you know, many of the animals we don't have nowadays, the megafauna we don't have nowadays, extinguished long ago, but extinguished through mass extinction processes. Well, for example, through let's say, ice age, changes in climate or things like those, right? So those were the mass extinctions that our world experienced. And now, many species, many taxa are actually reaching the same levels of mass extinction that were caused by major environmental changes in the air, but this is caused by human activity, right? So we're getting close in some particular cases. Now, agriculture, as we know, modern agriculture started in, let's say, mid-20th century. We refer to it as the Green Revolution. And that Green Revolution was basically a change in the architecture of plants, but also a change in production systems that brought us in close dependence on oil, right, for fertilizers. So production increased thanks to these changes, but also the use of water and nutrients and the use of pesticides increased enormously. For example, if we take cereals, right, only cereals, and we talk about yields on a global scale, the average yield of cereals doubled in the last half century. Double, on average. In some cases, it increased 10 times, in other cases, not. So on average, it doubled. But to be able to double yields, we had to multiply nitrogen used by 7, and fertilizer used by 3, and water used by 2, right? And nitrogen use in particular, we are now fixing nitrogen from the air through energy surplus that come from oil. So there is a strong relationship between nitrogen, fertilizer, and the use of fossil fuel, as many of you know, right? So if we wanted to double yields again towards the future, there is not enough oil to do this again. So we need to do it in a different way. And of course, this change in architecture of plants, moving from old varieties which were producing a lot of biomass, often we say less productive varieties, no? But they are not less productive. They produce less grain, but they produce a lot more biomass and a lot more roots as well. So this change in variety actually cost us a lot of carbon, because all this carbon was going before to the soil, and nowadays this is the amount of carbon potentially going to the soil. So that costed us 50 petagrams, which is 16 zeros, of carbon from the Earth's surface, just by changing our varieties, right? And of course, this change is associated with these new technologies, took place in central countries, and we had an impact on food production in many countries, but in other countries, we're still producing at the same levels as when this change started, right? So I'm sure Anne has been talking about this thing, so I'm not going to go much in detail, but we're still having this problem. And now, agriculture is highly dependent on oil. That's why we say we're eating fossil fuels, right? And if we think about oil reserves, actually we passed peak oil production, and that was in the 80s, in the late 70s, right? And that was about 6 barrels per person, right? And now if we think about today, feeding up an average person in the developed world costs about 12 barrels per year, right? So the maximum peak production we had was 6 per person. Now we are more people, and we are past peak production of oil. Of course, now there is cracking, there are other technologies, but still, none of the predictions are saying that we're going to get more oil. Right? And these are some of the consequences. This is the boreal forest in Canada, where they are extracting oil from bituminous sands, right? Tar sands. And these are pictures which are very familiar to people in South America, but also in parts of Africa. Deforestation for large-scale production of grain, in this particular case of soybean. And that has, of course, irreversible, very often irreversible impacts on nature and on people, the societies that live there. And most of the carbon that is stored in the soils and in the vegetation goes to the atmosphere, contributes to global warming. Now, when we talk about nature in particular and biodiversity in particular, which was the first topic to be addressed, we need to think about habitat quality. And when we look at the forest that remains in the world, it's actually highly fragmented forests. In 70% of the forest mass, wherever you stand in a forest, there is an edge within 1 kilometer distance, right? So the forest is interrupted within a distance of 1 kilometer. This is what this picture is showing, right? 70% of the forest mass, we have that. So the remaining forest is a highly fragmented forest, which is not apt for biodiversity conservation, not all biodiversity. Right? And of course, we know that there's other problems associated with that, which is soil erosion, severe soil erosion. So when we talk about biodiversity loss, we see that actually it's not independent from climate change adaptation and mitigation, right? It's not independent from people's livelihoods. Biodiversity loss is not just about having lions and zebras and these kind of animals. It's also about ecosystem services, right? So for example, here we have lots of recent publications that show us how important biodiversity is for the regulation and adaptation to climate change. One which may be curious to most of you is that whales, having lost so many whales through whaling in the last century, the baleine, whales, not Welsh people, means it's almost like deforestation of the sea, right? There was a lot of carbon stored in whales, and whales participate enormously to saving carbon from the air. So actually, the contribution of whales to capturing carbon to climate change mitigation is enormous, and we have not actually used this resource. Now, farming is the single largest threat to biodiversity, and of course there are many reasons for that. One is that we include species in an ecosystem, we remove other species from ecosystems, we alter the biogeochemical cycles, but we also alter the hydrological cycles, destroy key species, key habitats, and alter the disturbance regimes. Right? Imagine what it is for an earthworm to receive a plow, soil plow, and that's a disturbance regime for which it's not necessarily adapted. So, however, most of the biodiversity that we still find on Earth is in productive systems, right? In productive landscapes. So the protected areas are only 5% of the terrestrial surface, right? And there are many shifts associated with climate change, and about 40% of the global ice-free and desert-free land is used for agriculture, either as cropland or pasture. So, and that's where biodiversity is, right? Very often we see these sort of figures that show us how biodiversity is decreasing in farmland, right? For example, birds or butterflies, right? And that even makes it to the press. You know, for sure, you know the study that came last year came out saying that we in Europe lost 75% of the diversity of insects, right? Associated with agriculture. So why is that? Well, if we take this is a very nice image of a Dutch dairy farm, but this is a very nice, very diverse farm. And I'm using this picture to illustrate what this ecosystem looked like in the 50s. A dairy system in the 50s was an ecosystem that had different primary producers that produced different things and that could sustain the life of consumers, and those consumers sustain the life of secondary consumers and then of top predators, right? That's the ecosystem. How does it look this nowadays? Well, like this, right? We have simplified. We use, in the Netherlands in particular, 90% of the grasslands are a single species of grass, which is the ryegrass. Even let's say clover is farmers are finding hard to put clover next to it, so it's really ryegrass. And in many cases, the cow has been even replaced by a tractor that mows it, right? So we have disrupted this trophic web, right? So it's not surprising that you have less insects and you have less birds, right? And if we look into the soil, this is what we see here is the trophic network, the same that I was showing in the picture before, but this is at soil level, right? The trophic network at soil level. How is this represented? Well, different colors represent different functional groups in the soil. And the lines are the relationship between those groups, right? And the size of these little balls determines the amount that's available. So this is what happens when we remove the forest canopy. This comes from Brazil, right? So we simplify in terms of groups and in terms of connections. But what happened when we turn these pastures into soybean fields? This is what happens, right? So the same effect that we are seeing above ground, we could also see it below ground in the soil ecosystem. Right? Now we know already that certain forms of farming promote soil biodiversity, promote diversity at the level of functional groups, at enzymatic level, and also the level of species and taxa. And, well, I'm not going to go much into this, but there is the relationship between these nice drawings about soil biodiversity and food security is actually not so far away. We actually did a review of the existing literature recently, it came out this year, where we actually tried to test all these hypotheses. Each of these lines here is a hypothesis that shows how the functional groups in the soil, chemical engineers, biological regulators, ecosystem engineers, ultimately affect the different pillars of food security, right? Not just agricultural production, the different pillars of food security. So I invite you, if you're interested, to read the paper. Now, in terms of biophysics, in terms of soils, of course, we cannot just talk about biodiversity. It's also chemical pollution of the soils. What we see here is the pollution of nutrient, especially of nitrogen, in the vadose zone. The vadose zone is this area which is unsaturated, right, in between let's say the regional phreatic and the local phreatics, right? So this area of the Earth crust is full of nitrogen, right? It's a ticking bomb that any time can explode. Look at what was the situation in the 20s, in the 50s, in the 70s, and nowadays. This is a high concentration of nitrogen in the vadose zone associated with areas of high agricultural impact, right? So we're creating a bomb, a time bomb under our feet with all this amount of, if this escapes and goes into the seas, we have a major ecological problem. Again, the load of nitrogen, phosphorus is a major environmental problem. Now, what happens at the practice level? How does the farmer see all these ecological problems, these sort of catastrophes? Well, let me take one example, the example of herbicide-resistant weeds. You know that many weeds nowadays are resistant to herbicides, right? We use herbicides to kill them, they don't die. Why is that? In French, you could say it. What happens? There's adaptation. There are mutations, there are adaptations. So this is what we call the treadmill, right? It's been described for insects a lot. In the 70s, in the 90s, they talk about the pesticide treadmill. That you know what a treadmill is? You know when you go to a gym and you want to spend energy without going anywhere? There's a band where you can run, that's a treadmill. So people say, well, the pesticides very often make you do that, spend energy without going anywhere. Because what you create with continuous use of them is resistance. Well, the same happened with weeds, with plants, right? With adventices. So actually, when the Roundup Ready technology came up, you know what the Roundup Ready is. Roundup Ready means that the soybean has a gene that comes from a petunia, from another plant, that allows to stand doses of Roundup without dying. So fantastic. Everything else dies except for the soybean. Right, and they say, well, we're going to use less pesticide, less herbicide in this case. We're going to make the life easy for the producer, and it's very unlikely that weeds will develop resistance. But after some years of using that, we start seeing an increase in the use of herbicides, and the resistance is widespread. And, well, one of the things that people said in the 90s when this technology was introduced is say, well, by using this technology, you need to forget about 2,4-D or dicamba, which are very toxic herbicides. Right? Those who are agronomists know about this. 2,4-D or dicamba are very toxic herbicides, so with this technology, we forget about that. Nowadays, the technology is not working anymore, and so people say, well, now we have a problem, and the industry says, don't worry, now we're coming up with a new soybean, which is resistant to 2,4-D and dicamba, which was the ones that we wanted to get rid of 20 years ago, right? So actually, we say, well, are we really moving forward, or are we moving backwards, right, in these kind of things? And that is all cost for the farmer, because the farmer needs to pay for the patents associated with these supposedly new technologies. That's why we said this is also a treadmill. Here's some evidence of that, the amount of the use of glyphosate and the use of, so indeed, by incorporating this technology, we increase the use of glyphosate in the particular case, and this is the number of species that are registered as being resistant to herbicides. It's an exponential growth. But then we say, okay, there is no other option. We have to feed the world. We have to produce. So that's it. So we need, it's presented often as a trade-off. I mean, I like agroecology, I like organic farming, but I am realistic. I need to feed the world. As much as I would love everything to be organic and everything to be agroecological or local, but we have to be realistic. We have to feed the world. Did you hear that? Okay. I was just joking, eh? Don't film me and say, well, look what the guy is saying. I was just joking. Right. Let's look at some numbers. I'm going to present some figures, and probably the same figures that Anne shared with you this morning, but I'm going to propose you to look at them from a different angle. right? So what we have here, this is average yield per country, and we're talking about cereals, rice, wheat, maize, because cereals, they account for 80% of the calories that we ingest as humans, right? So cereals are a very good proxy to food availability or food intake. And what we have here is the contribution of each country to total food production, right? So this is how it looks like. It's a cumulative curve, right? And so one way in which you can read this is like this. You say, well, this is the 100%, all the countries. But if we take 50%, right, 50% of the production is taking place in countries where the yield are below 3 tons per hectare, right? Low yields, right? We can also read this in a different way. If we take all the countries where the yields are high, above 6 on average, which is on average is very high, well, all of them together, Western Europe, the US, they contribute 12.5%, right? Which means that they are not responsible for food security. Yeah? Very often I talk with farmers in different places, even in the Netherlands with very rudimentary Dutch. And I explain, because this thing that we have to feed the world, so we have to produce, everyone says it, but they say, look at the Netherlands, highly productive country, but what they contribute is 0.2% to the total, right? Yes? Yeah, you can have 1 square meter and be very high yields. Huh? Yeah.
And also it's a complete desert and must be irrigated.
It is irrigated and high. It's very intensive agriculture, right? But of course, the area must be minimum. This comes from this data source. Huh? So it's what is reported by the countries to the FAO. Right? I saw a hand over there. Okay. So what I mean to say with this is that when we look at these sort of figures, we have to concentrate here, right? Because here we have countries where the yields, increasing yields here is really hard. Environmentally it's very hard. And it's not very efficient. And in many of these cases it's with subsidies. That's why it's so high, it's highly productive. So these countries where the yields are below 2 tons, on average 1.3, they explain 15% of total production, and that's where most hungry people live, in those countries. We're talking about lots of area, lots of people living here. So if we think about feeding the world and having to increase agricultural production to feed the world, where would you go? Where do you think we need to increase food production? Right? So if we really want to be serious about feeding the world and producing more, we need to produce more in places where people need it, because here also, it can also be an engine for development. So as it was explained already, we have areas in the world where production is there, areas in the world that are in demand, and between those there are many, many barriers. There are many demands which are more easily met than poor people in remote rural areas, right? So we produce enough, but it's a problem of distribution, right? So we need to think about technologies and management practices that can improve food production in these situations, right? If we think about energy efficiency at global scale, what we see is that the most productive areas of the world, which are here in red, actually are the ones that deliver the least of the lesser proportion of the energy that they capture from the sun into the food system. And if we look at diets in general in the world, what we see is an increasing homogeneity of diets, from the diversity we ate in the 60s to the 80s to nowadays. Actually, we humans are eating from less and less crops, right? We're deriving our food from less and less crops, so we're affecting diversity, right? And so when it comes to food security, it's not just about quantities, it's also about access, stability, but also utilization. Utilization, imagine that in many parts of the world, people are not able to cook a warm meal a day because they don't have firewood. So there's a problem of energy efficiency as well. And utilization also means a balanced diet. To be able to incorporate the proteins or the energy that you intake, you need a balanced diet, a balanced distribution of nutrients in the diet to be able to assimilate, to utilize it. Right? So nutrition is very much in line with food security. Now, because of that, and because nutritionists, they say, well, you know, diet-related deaths are the #1 cause of death today. Diets kill more people than car accidents. Diets, or bad diets, kill more people than wars nowadays. Right? So these nutritionists, they came together, they published in a high-impact journal with these calculations, and they say, well, let's calculate what would be the need for a balanced diet in terms of different food items, the items that you see here, right? And let's calculate that with respect to what we have already. So the yellow bars there is what we're producing at the moment, and the blue line there is what we need for a balanced diet. It's not a vegan diet, it's not a diet to run a marathon, it's just balanced, it's a diet to reduce the likelihood of dying because of coronary diseases or things like those, right? So you see, for example, we take whole grains, the world is producing 54% more than what we need, right? If we take vegetables, are we producing enough? How much less? 11%, right? 11%. Nuts, seeds, fruits, most of them are tree crops. We're producing about half of what we need, right? And we can think, well, where do we put those trees? Well, maybe we can think about agroforestry systems where we can put those trees somewhere with the rest of the production, right? Milk, my dairy Dutch farmers are very happy when I show this because they say, well, milk, we need 50% more milk, but of course, milk is 87% water, right? So we cannot think about transporting milk all over the planet. Fish, we know we're overfishing, right? And of course, it was already mentioned, meat, but look at this figure. Red meat, we're not talking about all meat, we're talking about red meat in this particular case, is produced 5 times more than what we need. Yes?
Just a quick question. Percentage of what we need, is that what we need in order to feed everyone on the planet a balanced diet?
On a balanced diet.
Okay.
Yeah. On a balanced diet that contains a balanced participation of these different food items, right? So 5 times more. So the discourse is normally, incomes increase, people eat more meat. Yes?
I think where the question is what we need in order to produce all the food or in order to feed ourselves?
What we need to feed ourselves is the blue line. The yellow line, the yellow bar, is what we produce today.
Yeah, no, I mean grains, for example, in order to produce milk or meat or fish, you need to feed them.
With grains, it's accounted for. It is accounted for. It is considered. Yes, thanks for the question. It is considered. Today, when I said that 80% of our calories come from cereals, it's not that we're eating cereals all the time, but they're used to feed the animals that we eat later on. It's a good question. Thanks. Right, so the discourse is normally that we need to produce more meat because, well, incomes are going higher, but we know that we're producing enough and we actually need to reduce that, right? Of course, we had a very interesting presentation about how to change consumers' behavior. How do we make sure that we're going to eat less red meat? It's very hard. Apparently, it's difficult to put regulations. It's difficult to convince the consumers. We know that, right? But I always put the same example here, and it's the example of smoking. Smoking, right? If I would have given this lecture 20 or 30 years ago, I could have smoked here and looked very cool smoking and talking about these things, right? Well, nowadays, it's not allowed, right? Do you see any signboards saying that it's not allowed? They're not necessary anymore, right? Because now it became morally unacceptable to do that, right? And nobody ever thinks about such a thing, but we don't even need that. So there are ways in which we can change some behaviors. Of course, I know it is difficult, I know, but there are ways in which that started as a prohibition and became a moral norm or something like that, right? So when we look at local markets, still see a lot of crops which are actually considered weeds, right? In many places that are still an important contribution to people's diet in many parts of the world, right? For example, a study showed that in the central market of Mexico City, there are 120 species which are sold on the market which are not classified botanically, right? So that's the diversity we're still using as humans, and that doesn't go in the records, right? But that contributes enormously to nutrition. We show this, for example, for a case study in Western Kenya where we show the contribution of all these weeds to the diet of people, especially in terms of scarcity, right? And here's also an interesting case where we see that the remains of forest in this landscape in Burkina Faso, this is a picture from the dry season, actually during the season of scarcity, they may contribute up to, I mean, what people get from the forest may contribute up to 30% of the requirement in terms of vitamin A, right? So again, another proof that biodiversity is not just about having lions and giraffe. Are there ways of farming with nature? Well, there are ways of getting inspired from nature, right? For example, if we see this picture in the Sahel, what we see here in Niger, this is a picture that I took from a road. Right? This is a millet, cowpea crop. And turning around, I took the same picture, but for the natural vegetation there. And we see that the natural vegetation there is able to produce, with the same sandy soil, with the same harsh environmental conditions, 10 times more biomass. So there is something to be learned from there. Of course, you can't eat all this biomass yourself, but there's a way that we could learn and try to incorporate all that knowledge into our systems, as this picture, very nice picture, was drawn, but this was for Madagascar, actually. So Cubans have understood that very well, as you may know, during the special period where they were cut off from the Soviet Union, had no more agricultural inputs, no more oil. They had to find ways of farming, and they did, using these principles. And what we learned from this sort of meta-analysis that Jules Pretty did, he looked at many projects in Africa, and he saw the potential of yield increasing potential of different interventions, which are more like process technologies, and he sees that there is an impact of over many, many hectares. An impact that is about 2. For example, when it is 2, it means that doubling yields, right? So all this, and these are actual projects, these are not papers, right? It's not the papers are not true, but these are projects where things were implemented on this amount of hectares, right? And one of the challenges that remains for us, especially in developing countries, is that soils are very degraded. There's a huge amount of soils which are severely degraded and need to be restored. When we think about that upper corner of the figure with the 15% of production, well, that takes place in very degraded soils. What we see here is an agricultural soil that was used and used and used and was degraded, right? So how do we restore the productivity of those soils? And that's where I think agroecology can play a major role, right? By thinking about specific management techniques, but also especially by thinking about organization of people, of actors, bringing people together to try to restore the soils. Restoring soils is not something that a farmer can do individually. You need collective action, right? So this, let's say, organization and innovation is as important as any other technical innovation that you could propose, right? In those situations. And here is a picture that actually put it quickly after the question of our colleague there about agroecology in Africa, which is true, and I agree that agroecology in Africa, we can't say that people have been doing agroecology forever, but these are groups, agroecology projects in Burkina Faso, groups, civil society organizations in Burkina Faso, in a study that we did 2 years ago, how many people were actively promoting agroecology in a country like Burkina Faso, and it's going on. So let's not think that agroecology or this wave is only something that happens in South America or here in France. It's also happening in many places in the world, right? Not for, I mean, you know that the Nyeleni declaration was done in Mali 10 years ago, and so since then people are busy with these things. Of course, there are ways to do agroecology with high tech in places like the Netherlands, with farmers, young farmers also being highly knowledgeable, using a lot of biodiversity, for example, for cover crops. There are all kinds of ways of doing agroecology and adapt it to the place where you are. It's not just about, small is beautiful, right? But if we try to put some value to what nature contributes to our farming, here, let's concentrate on the ecosystem services which are mediated by arthropods. Basically, pollination, pest control, weed predation, etc. And there we see that, for example, when we talk about pest control, we're talking about 400 billion US a year for free that we get. Right? 120 billion in terms of pollination. These are ecosystem services we get from arthropods for free. Right? And if we manage the landscape, if we design the landscape in certain ways, we can actually make use of that, right? And optimize those processes in our farming systems. Well, I'm not going to go into this because I'm sure you're agronomists, you're biologists, you know all this, right? But coming up with ideas such as designing landscapes, designing pest suppressive landscapes cannot be done only at the level of a single farm, right? You need collective action. Again, you need farmers working together, neighbors working together. So some of the projects in which we are involved now, and this comes from Argentina actually, is actually trying to go that extra step, to say, well, let's not work with a single farmer. Agroecology needs a community, needs a group of farmers who are collectively working and designing their landscapes. A landscape approach necessarily needs a community approach, right? And so how can we make sure that farmers collaborate and they bring their design closer? So for example, if we think about the landscape, we can actually think about areas with different functionality in those landscapes that different farms can perform. I don't have time to go into that detail. And in terms of grazing system, and this is the last example I'd like to share, also it's possible to produce meat with ecosystem services, right? It's not just that meat production is always bad, right? Actually, this is a project in which we have a number of, it's a program with projects where we're looking at alternative ways of producing meat in these grasslands, in these native grasslands of South America. Sorry, quickly, but here is a part of Argentina, Uruguay, part of Brazil. This is a large ecosystem, large grassland ecosystem. There's never been trees there. It's never been a forest. It's been always a grassland. And, well, for example, these grasslands, they stored 5% of the carbon of the whole continent, including the tundra, Alaska, and all that. So 5% of the carbon is stored in those grasslands. So already a very important ecosystem service. Of course, also provisioning services, right? And when we compare systems there, well, we have, let's say, a gradient of possibilities from the traditional family livestock rearing system to the intensive feedlot. You know what a feedlot is? You put all the animals in a place, a small place, and you feed them grain, right? They don't have to move much, so they don't have to waste energy. They're just somewhere and they're fed, right? Maybe sometimes they cut some grass and they bring the grass, but they don't move. Basically, they don't move. And so you actually kill the animal, you slaughter the animal when younger, because otherwise the rumen doesn't really function for long, right? When you're feeding grain to animals which are evolved with grasses, I mean, you create the problem. So normally you slaughter those animals earlier, right? So, of course, when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, you say, well, you know, the feedlot system is actually better for the environment, right? Because we have less emissions per kilo of meat. But why do we have less emissions per kilo of meat? Well, on the one hand, because the animals live shorter times. No? So if we divide by the number of days an animal is alive, it's less time. On the second hand, because eating grass, actually, when an animal, a ruminant, eats grass, it's actually feeding the bacteria. And the bacteria produce burps, which have methane, right? So actually, that is what's called rumination, generates a lot of greenhouse gases, right? When you feed grain, you don't do that. You bypass the rumen and you go straight to the stomach. So you save burps, let's say, right? So those are the major reasons. And also the way it's calculated, because it's calculated per kilo of meat and not per time or per hectare or anything like that. And of course, less emissions than the traditional system. And in between, there are other possibilities. But when we look at the other indicators and think about the planetary boundaries, because those indicators are inspiring the planetary boundaries, what you see is that actually this system is the worst, right, in many other situations. But of course, because the climate is dominating the environmental discussions, we very often have to hear people concluding that intensive livestock production is environmentally friendlier than traditional production, right, or than free grazing. So it's important to, in these cases, also think about what sort of indicators we're using. And to conclude, because my train is leaving, then I'd like to reinforce this idea, the idea that technical innovation and institutional, organizational innovation need to go hand in hand, right? We can't think about one without the other, right? If we want to move from current systems to something that we may call agroecological landscapes, et cetera, whatever we want to call it, we don't know what the trajectory is going to look like. It may start from here, or it may start from here, but we know that there's going to be bottleneck. There's always a bottleneck, right? How do you say bottleneck in French? Voila. There you go. So bottlenecks, one of them is what we call the input substitution phase, right? So the first thing you do when you want to move in this trajectory is to go for eco-efficiency. What does it mean, eco-efficiency? I'll say it in a very provocative way. It means business as usual, but a bit better, right? So we do the same, but we do it with a precision machine, so we have less impact, but we don't change the practice. We just tweak the system a little bit, right? Sounds like agro-environmental measures in the European Union. Just tweak the system a little bit, but not transforming your system. Now, input substitution is a bit further. You continue with the same logic of production, but instead of using a chemical pesticide, you use a biological pesticide. But you're still using a pesticide, right? You do not have built in the ecosystem services necessary to regulate your pests in the landscape, right? You're just doing business as usual, but using inputs which are allowed. But of course, these are transition phases. I'm not saying that this is not important. All of this is important. This is also important. This is important. These are necessary transition phases, right? Some people argue that you may actually jump from here to here. Well, it's not so easy. And then systems redesign, which when we start thinking about systems redesign, in agroecology at least, we cannot think about a single farmer. We need to think about a group of farmers, a community, as I explained earlier, right? So what we do, well, when we do optimization, we can actually, as much as we can push optimization, we can actually move towards eco-efficiencies. If we start bringing regulations or start relying on the consumer drive for example, labeling, etc., that can take us as far as input substitution, but per se, it will not take you any further, because as long as you comply with what's in the label, that's it, right? But to go beyond that, what we need is a co-evolution of social organizations, right? Including consumers, farmers, community-supported agriculture, you name it, right? And of course, from the policy point of view, what we need is a territorial development approach, right? We can't think about sectorial policies anymore. Yeah, and this is what we call the critical transition phase, and that's a zone of high vulnerability, and policies should also be oriented to actually safeguard farmers during that transition. We can't just penalize the farmer and ask the farmer to make the sacrifice and go through this transition without us taking any responsibility. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo. Do you have some question? Yes? You need the microphone.
Thank you for your talk. My question, well, I have two actually. The first one is, at the beginning when you showed the graph of the productivity of cereals, you said basically that we had to focus on the countries with a low productivity, such as Southeast Asian. countries like that, I agree. But the thing is, in countries where you have basically a low yield, it's also very likely that you still have low intensity agriculture. My question is, how do you think it would be possible to find the balance between increasing the yields and not falling into the trap of high intensity agriculture, which basically furthers biodiversity loss? Because in systems where you have problems already, it's easy to sort of steer towards sustainable solutions. But when you're still in the phase of wanting to produce more and more and more in order to feed your local population, then that's much more difficult.
Yeah, thank you very much. A very short answer to that would be, we should not run away from intensification, but we need to think about an ecological intensification of those systems, right? But I mean, I've spent 10 years working in Africa, and in South American places which are also very marginal in terms of productivity. And you see that very tiny agronomic measures in those situations can actually improve yields enormously. I have papers published about just planting dates, right? Or the choice of varieties, or soil cover, or things which are minimal, which may require more labor or more attention from the farmer, but they have a huge potential to actually move from 1 ton to 2 tons. Very easy. I mean, this first leap from 1 ton to 2 tons is huge. I mean, it's huge what you can do with very simple agronomic measures. But yet, that's not enough, right? Because what you need is something that also produces surpluses for the markets. Most people in the world are going to be urban, and they're already urban, so we need to produce for the markets. So we need, but in my view, what agroecology can offer has more chances to increase yields stably in those situations than any other technology. What we see, for example, in case of fertilizer use, fertilizer use has been pushed in Southern Africa for 40 years, right? And there was a summit in 2006 funded by the fertilizer industry about the World Summit on Fertilizers, and all the governments agreed to increase fertilizer use to 50 kilograms per hectare from what was then 10 kilo per hectare at country level, and that was in 2006. We are now 13 years later, and what we see is still the same levels of adoption. Farmers are, they are, on the one hand, they are aware of what the different technologies can offer, and on the other hand, many farmers in Africa, many smallholder farmers in Africa, are not there by choice. They're not farming by choice. When you do surveys there and you ask people, why are you farming? Why are you there? In many cases, people reply, because I'm unemployed, right? It's not a first choice activity. So also the typology of farmers that we need to target in those situations is different and so expecting that agriculture or a certain agronomic practice by its own is going to bring that development, well, it's too much to ask from agriculture. We have, a very Western center view on how things work, because in many of our societies, including some societies in Latin America, we went from a first initial age of agricultural development and then industrialization and then services, right? As much as Argentina or Brazil are agricultural countries, still agriculture is no more than 10% of their GDP. Services and industry are already more important, right? So it's not that, but we think that today we can replicate that model as well, right? And that by increasing yields, then poor countries will become industrialized in the future. But that's not the case. It's actually what you see is that yield increase goes along with economic development in general, with more roads, more jobs, with more schools, with more of everything else, right? So I think when we think about those pictures, I simplify it with cereal production, but it's not so simple as that agriculture will actually move countries out of poverty.
Encore une question pour qu'on puisse respecter à peu près le temps. Oui. À gauche.
Thank you very much for your talk. Just a quick question. You did speak about the olive peak. And the message I got is the energy really like the limiting factor regarding agriculture, since like the US is swimming in oil at the moment due to fracking, and I would just say it's, in my opinion, it's not the case. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, the figures are presented where perhaps needs updating, right? But because they are 2 or 3 years old. But if you remember the figure, the projections towards the future were the projections made by the companies themselves, right? So companies do not project another peak oil production, right? Of course, fracking actually brought us a new source of oil. Also, the tar sands also brought us a new source of oil, but it's not enough to produce the same peak oil production that was produced in the 80s. That's I mean, it's not my opinion. It's just what the reports say. But you may, I don't know, they may find oil in the moon at some point and bring, I don't know. Could be, but there's no, let's say, there is a scenario of new availability of oil strong enough to assume that prices will remain low, but not to repeat peak oil production.
Okay, thank you. We have to switch to the other presentation. Thank you, Pablo. And